Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Leila Cedo. I'm Cabinet Chief for CISS on behalf of our Secretary General, Dr. Gibran Ramirez Reyes, and representation of the 84 member institutions of the International Conference on Social Security. I would like to welcome you to this very awaited regional forum on pensions. A forum that, due to the sanitary crisis, had to be suspended. It's a traditional edition, which was proposed originally for February, and now we're retaking that. From CISS, we're committed to boosting the dialogue on, towards benefit of people because of this pandemic that has made fragile different social security systems and that will surely bring about an increase in equality, social inequality, especially that of gender. It is necessary to discuss regarding different mechanisms and policies to be able to face social risks, and also tending after the basic needs of each of the stages of life of our population in our regions. I would like to invite you to be a part of these four tables that make up the forum that we'll have in the following 2 days, where we will see the viewpoints of different international organizations, scholars, and other specialists that will analyze everything pertaining to pensions and the way to face this new reality. Without further ado, I declare this forum as formally opened. This regional 2020 forum on pensions from the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. Thank you very much, and we will begin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending panel number 1, entitled Pension Systems in the Americas, 39 Years of Reforms. So the topic that we'll be discussing in this first panel is very important and is very pertinent to start the discussion about pension systems in the Americas. Especially because 39 years ago, back in 1981, we had a very important first step that would mark the transformations of the pension systems in decades to come in Latin American countries and even in other continents like in Eastern Europe or in Africa. In that year, the pension system in Chile was completely privatized. An individual account regime was instated, and this became a model to follow by other international organizations, which had some success in some countries like Mexico, where the seat of the conference lies, as well as other countries. 39 years after this reform, 39 years after this model of individual capitalization was instated, we've had a widespread of different types of changes. And now we have completely privatized systems, parallel systems, mixed systems, and some distribution systems even. Our panel members today will address each of these processes, and they will discuss what has happened after 9 years of reforming the pension systems in the Americas. All of them are first level researchers and analysts, published authors, which will provide very enlightening conferences on this subject. So we sent you some guidelines that will steer the discussion in this table within the regional forum on pensions. One question is, what's your take on these 39 years of reform pension systems in the region? Number two, what do you think of the causes of the reforms and counter reforms in the region's pension systems? Number three, why some countries have decided to revert reforms and some of them have sustained them? Number four, what are the challenges facing the pension systems in terms of coverage, replacement rates, and financial sustainability? So as to answer these questions, we have in this panel Berenice Ramirez Lopez, Isabel Ortiz, and Andras Uthoff. The presentations will start with Dr. Berenice Martinez Lopez, and I will briefly read her summary. Dr. Ramirez Lopez is a researcher from the Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas from UNAM, is a scholar in the postgraduate courses from the School of Social Sciences and Philosophy and Spanish language, and a representative from the Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas, Desarrollo y Políticas Públicas, as well as a coordinator of the research and assessment workshop of pension systems in Mexico. And she's been an officer economic affairs from the Economic Convention for Latin America and the Caribbean. Without further ado, I will pass the floor to Dr. Ramirez Lopez. Doctor, please, could you please share your screen with us? We cannot see it right now. Thank you. Yes. So, good morning. I would like to thank the Inter-American Conference on Social Security's invitation for me to be able to talk about the assessment on pension systems in Latin America. And it is indeed my pleasure sharing this table with two specialists, Ms. Ortiz and Andrea Suto, with a lot of expertise on this subject matter. I would like to focus on one of the guiding questions in assessing pension systems, which is the following. Have you solved the problem of economy, like personal individual economy at all age? So regarding this, I should say that it's been demonstrated that the region is undergoing severe problems to put together contribution-based pension systems which are universal that envelops the whole population. Systems which are sufficient in terms of what they grant, in terms of monetary amounts, and something that's enough for people to survive, and which are fiscally sustainable. And despite the reforms and the counter-reforms, these deficits are still maintained in Latin America. Try to move on when it comes to coverage based on instrumentation and non-contribution based pensions, but the laborist perspective still prevails by identifying only as subjects of being insured those salaried workers who are subordinate. And, well, we have a reproduction of exclusion, inequality, inequity, and fragmentation amongst the workforce. So we're still moving along in this line of only acknowledging subordinates as salaried workers, and we're leaving aside, we're really neglected in terms of protection and coverage, all other workers who are individual, independent, farm workers, service workers. And that's why coverage, instead of increasing, has been decreasing. Now I will draw some data from a conference report on Social Security, where we have a coverage index and a transition index. To be able to point out the situation of coverage in 2016 in 19 countries in the Americas. And there are some countries in the region with a high coverage. That's the case of Argentina. And we'll move downwards to see medium coverage. That means percentage of people over 65 years of age who have a pension, or with some type of support for their old age. And like I mentioned, we have countries with a high degree of coverage like Argentina, medium like Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Uruguay, low like Panama, Mexico, and Ecuador, and very low Central American countries like El Salvador, Paraguay, Nicaragua, Peru, Honduras, and Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. But what really calls my attention is how from 2009 to 2016 in these transitions, all these countries have a downwards trend. That is, say they have lesser coverage in the case of Brazil, Uruguay, Bolivia, Colombia, Panama, Paraguay, El Salvador, and Dominican Republic. The ones that I didn't mention, well, is because they remain with the scores they had. And this talks about how this problem is becoming more acute in terms of coverage. Now, what I would like to mention about this is the behavior of the work market and the creation of protected labor are incredibly important for social security, contributional social security. But this is also a very important access undertaken today by non-contributional old age contributions. But there's a lot of inequality because the money amounts offered by the state are very low. And what's even more concerning is that if we were to build social security as its origin sets forth, with distributional purposes, because that's why it was created, it's only focusing on the construction on the one hand, forceful or mandatory systems, or focalized assistance systems only focused on mitigating poverty. Now, before these two considerations, what conclusions can we draw from this? Number one, why have we see self-financed pension, social security, self-financed pensions in the horizons as the only solution? Well, first, because we have a prevalence of the discourse of imminent aging, which we're of course undergoing that process, as opposed to analyzing the work or the labor markets. More the acknowledgement of a labor rights for all types of work, so that has not advanced. And second point is what this discrepancies in distributional and assistance policies have to do. I don't think that the liberal perspective of the state that was in for decades ago has changed, where the state was in charge of only tending after those who couldn't go to the market to purchase pensions, health, education, and in this way it tries to strengthen that perspective and to change the vision of the state in this distributive vision, and how to move away from this. Well, by having precise information, the results of the systems in the past 4 years, by means of analysis of what they have produced or what they might produce, and with proposals. And touching upon the first point, why do we have in the horizon of social security self-financed pensions as the only option? I think that to be able to accept this position, we should emphasize aging, mainly to demonstrate that there's no room for distribution systems, and to also make emphasis in the freedom of choice, property, responsibility, individual responsibility, that is, but all this within the framework of mandatory savings. Likewise, we have prevalence in the economic analysis, this perspective that the behavior of the stock indexes might be yielding more than the growth rates of the workforce or work productivity, which might sustain the contribution-based pension systems. So, since we don't have this growth in workforce, protected workforce that is, that's what has yielded as a result a crisis of contribution-based systems. And on the other hand, because instead of facing structural weaknesses and institutional weaknesses characterized Social Security in Latin America since its early stages, I'm talking about the 30s and the 40s, that led to dispersion, that led to specific collective bargaining contracts or agreements, and from where a lot of inequalities stem from, as the Mexican case, our very constitution, Article 23. It's cataloging workers in paragraphs A and B, has difference in terms of benefits, make differences in terms of public officers. So we have certain distortions there, and instead of targeting these institutional weaknesses, structural reforms, what they're doing is just closing down populations starting from scratch and considering that the individual capitalization and private management, all these problems will be solved, when the reality or the main problem that they're causing is that by eliminating of solidarity, intergenerational solidarity, they just reinforce individualism, and the cost of pensions will increase, and the cost of transition will also increase because they're not solving that problem. So we're still undergoing the dispute of financing models. Our social security systems were born partially funded in the region that was the electoral construct, but due to several institutional political circumstances, they were transformed into pure distribution-based systems, and instead of strengthening that part of funding or partially funding them, they completely became completely or totally funded, which is not solving any problems. And what's on the table right now as alternatives of better or larger content is using this partially funded systems. And the situation has led to, whenever there's a dialogue about pensions, it seems to be only two models: distribution and individual capitalization, private management, where the reality is that in the world we have a lot of combinations between contribution-based systems with distribution systems, with public management, private management, or capitalized through national accounts, or construction of mixed systems, some integrated, some complementary, some others competing amongst themselves, others which are non-contribution based and universal. And this has led to choose between this polarity in the region, whether distribution or private capitalization, when the reality is that there are other modalities. Now, to elaborate on this dispute between distribution and capitalization, I already pointed this out in the sense that if there's not been dynamic, well-protected growth, increasing wages, and growth and construction of well-being institution, there will be, of course, be an absence of these distribution policies. And it's even more evident the fact that the markets, by not warranting socially efficient results, well, in the past 4 decades, the inequalities have increased. And we will only have growth in poverty, and the only thing we're tending is how to manage this using focal social programs. How to move away from this? I think that we should ask ourselves, this generation and the following generations, if they will have pensions, and will these be larger amounts, and will they be sustainable throughout time? And another important question is whether saving more has had any sort of correspondence to an increase in well-being. So based on these ideas, I think that we'll be able to revise more profoundly the failure of individual capitalization, private management as the only mechanism of insurance and well-being, and also trying to tackle a lot of myths, like long-standing myths, and while proposing alternatives for nowadays workforce. And also we should examine financing models that will improve the future functioning of pension systems. Now, for purposes of this forum, I went over some references from the 90s, like Orszag's and Stiglitz 10 myths, which are still current. What they pointed out, why this would not solve many of pension problems. And why they wouldn't have any incidence in terms of internal savings. and the growth of internal savings. And if we have a government with an efficient traditions, why private initiative in this context will become efficient from one day to the other, or even providing some sort of clarity to type of profitability that they're offering. So I think that in the core of the proposals, we should put the construction of economic security towards the risks of old age and, well, the necessary construction of certainty. We cannot be using this profitability of financial market that will lead the workers to not knowing what they will find, depending on the crisis, depending on the cost of assets, but giving them certainty to be able to build well-defined pensions, which will be very well strengthened in terms of financial construction. And well, showing a lot of the myths or shedding light on many of the myths that have been built in terms of private management. So we did a recount on profitability of Afore in Mexico, and we were able to realize that profitability does not go over 2% since 1997 to date. But we're also concerned because the initiative that has been proposed, it's up for approval in Congress, as the only way to point out the need to carry out a reform, which is demographic aging, thus weakening the analysis of the behavior of the labor market, and it also weakens the fiscal cost that we will incur in to try to provide a warranted pension for the workers. Just to end my participation, I would like to leave you with this idea for the second part of our discussion. I think that the universal social security should be one of the core structures that will allow to face basic risks of a vital cycle and also risks derived from lack of income from the pandemics that we faced, showing the frailty of life, which makes social security first condition for care of life. So that's it for my presentation. Now I'll leave the floor to the rest of panel members. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramirez Lopez. And I think that you're talking to core elements for our discussion. I concur wholeheartedly to what you say regarding how is it that the options that we've had to reform pension systems are more centered in elements like profitability or starting from economic principles or even old age instead of putting well-being of people core. So social security should place right in the core, being able to care for the well-being of people. So I think what you said is very pertinent. And of course, we aspire to having universal social security. It's undeniable that its destination, behavior, and development is linked to labor and economic dynamics. So I think that any serious analysis of any reform that tries or that aims to look for the well-being of people cannot omit also doing a deep analysis of labor conditions and the economic structure of the countries in the region. And also these observations are very precise because we should debunk the myths of capitalization systems. And you mentioned documents by Stiglitz, but also this observation gives way to talk about a very important document that was published last year, which was in charge of our next panel member, Dr. Isabel Ortiz, which talks about the reversion of privatization of pension systems around the world. And this clearly details different shortcomings that were tried to be sold as strengths. And at the end of the day, we saw that these have been far more costly than we thought, and they provide less coverage than originally thought about. So we have the author of such an important piece of research, which is now an international reference for discussions. So now I will pass the floor to our next panel member. I will make a short introduction. Her name is Isabel Ortiz. She's director of Programa de Justicia Social from Columbia University. She's a doctor in economy by the London School of Economics, and she's worked in over 50 countries in different regions in the world, consulting governments and social policies for social protection. She was the director of social protection, the ILO, and like I already mentioned, she coordinated one of the most important pieces of work in contemporary discussion on reforms to the pension systems. So, doctor, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much and good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to this pension forum, where I would like to present the piece of research that you mentioned. This piece of research that took years in the making. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you see it now? Very well. Just a moment, please. So again, this research took years in the making, where we're analyzing the reversion of privatization of pensions that happened throughout this last decade. So there's a lot of talk about private systems or mandatory pensions and how this system is successful, where the reality is that only 30 countries in the world privatize their pension systems. And to put things in perspective, there are 192 countries in the world, so only 30, a very, very small number, really privatized their pension systems. This was an experiment tried out in 14 countries in Latin America, 14 in Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, and 2 in Africa. And this experiment has led to these results. And at the end of the day, the results have been mostly negative. So that's why 18 countries out of the 30 have reverted, either partially or completely, pension privatization, and they have re-reformed their systems. And it is an important lesson. Most of this privatization that happened started out in Latin America with Chile back in 1981, backed up by the World Bank, World Monetary Fund, ILO, Inter-American banks of development, despite and against warnings from the ILO. It already predicted many other problems to come. Actually, during these close to 4 decades, it's been demonstrated all the problems behind using the systems. If you're interested in this, and I'm sorry, the 18 countries that have completely or partially reverted these pensions: Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, Slovakia, Estonia, Lithuania, Bolivia, Hungary, Slovakia, Macedonia, Russia, Kazakhstan, Czech Republic, and Romania. So we'll see the reasons why these countries have reverted privatization. These are some of the lessons learned after almost 4 decades of privatizations. First, well, I made a list. And in some cases, the book has a lot of tables and examples that you can refer to. But this is a very brief summary. So the first reason is that coverage rates were stagnant or decreased, and this is important because private systems, which would be so appealing to people that everybody were supposed to have run to them, well, they became stagnant. In Argentina, coverage dropped 20%, which is very important. Then the benefit levels were deteriorated. This was one of the main causes why countries reverted privatization. Gender inequality and income inequality increased. What happened was the replacement rates dropped tremendously. So it's not a small drop. We're talking about dramatic drops of replacement rates. The amount of a pension that you're going to receive, the minimum recommended by ILO, it's 40%, 40% of prior income. And, well, you should think that in Chile this dropped to 15%. But this is an aggregate, because for the lowest income workers, that was 3%. So they would only receive 3% of the income they used to have. In Bolivia, it was 20%. In Kazakhstan, it went from 60% to 30%. So these are a small piece of information for you to realize. And as a result of all this, well, gender inequality increased and income inequality increased. Because what happened, since this is an individual balanced system, people have their savings. And, well, they save on a monthly basis as they work. So, of course, for high-income workers, this does not represent a problem, but for workers with more precarious works or with breakages in the collective contracts or with low income, the problem is that you arrive at the end with a pension that's completely insufficient. So, what we see in all countries is the increase in poverty at old age, especially poverty as it pertains to gender. Elderly women are in an even more precarious situation in private systems. Now, the other big reason why the governments started to make the transition back towards reverting pensions were the very high transition costs. And this is also funny because it was thought that private systems would be way less expensive, removing a lot of tax burden from governments, and this turned out to be the other way around. As a matter of fact, private systems ended up being extremely expensive because the problems were transition costs that were supposed to have been paid to private fund managers to cover for all the costs and well, to pass all the contributions from day one of the workers' working life, and these costs are super high. Just some figures in Chile back in 2010, it was it represented 4% of GDP. So I mean, this is a very high amount of GDP devoted to these transference costs. In Argentina, the World Bank underestimated 18 times the cost of the government from going to public to private system. So these consultancies made with international organizations were poorly made because it didn't reflect the reality going towards the future. So there were a series of deficiencies in terms of governance. So these points that I have explained so far were the core reasons. And I also realized that I skipped some slides, but it is enough for you to see all this information, more in-depth information. You can find the book. You can download it free online, and there's a summary in Spanish. Another item were management costs, which were very high. Now, public systems are usually inexpensive, but private systems have a bunch of fees: management fees, investment fees, custody fees, warranty, marketing, legal fees, and so on. And what this does is reducing the accrued savings by investors. Now, for a period of 4 years of contributions, the reduction that these high management costs have is estimated to reduce up to 39% pensions in Lithuania, 31% in Estonia, and 20% in Bulgaria. And some other examples. Here you have management costs prior to privatization. In Argentina, it was 6% in 1990, and after privatization, they ended up around 50%. So you have more figures, and of course, all these numbers are very high. Then we have other problems with governance. The first problem is that private fund managers or governing systems did not include beneficiaries, that is, say, pension holders or unions. These represent investors, and this has very important ramifications. Social dialogue has deteriorated in the large majority of countries under the systems. But aside from that, we had a different capture of functions of regulation and supervision, or oversight in the superintendencies, or in the pension superintendencies. And this has been very peculiar. When these pension superintendencies were formed to regulate, to oversee the private pension systems, we didn't have that many people with experience in private pensions. And we came to this revolving door where they came out of the industry, they entered into this pension superintendencies, and that removed all bias that these organizations are supposed to have. And that's why one of the first measures that we should take is eliminating this pension superintendencies when countries revert pension systems. And there's another question that you should ask for yourselves: is who benefited from this savings of individuals? And that's a question that we should be asking ourselves. And that's very important. Let me explain. In Europe, for instance, when the reserves of the pension systems were used for national development, for example, in Finland, pensions were used to create rural electric power. So that promoted national development. The problem is that all that was broken by individual accounts and investment individual accounts. So in these countries, there is no national regulation on this, or it's very restrictive in such a way that you arrive to this absurd situation in which savings from people in Bulgaria, Bolivia, and Kazakhstan end up being invested in Wall Street or in Tokyo or Frankfurt stock market. And this, from the development standpoint, is very, very criticizable. So in the end, we can see who ended up being benefited by these pensions, and that's financial sector. And this small chart here, what it shows are the assets from private pension funds capitalization in millions of dollars to the left and expressed in GDP percentage to the right. And those countries have privatized their pensions. And you see that they start out for almost nothing and they end up growing and growing and growing until we arrive 13% of GDP of the countries, or 700, close to $700 million. And this, of course, generates very large amount of interests, which are setting pressure in a lot of countries for privatization to continue, even if there's very little evidence that this has any public benefit. So, moving with this point, the last point, which is just very important, is that the risk of financial markets, demographic financial markets, are passed on to the individuals, and that's why a lot of countries reverted pension privatization with the world's economic crisis. So in 2018, markets were in crisis, and this was transferred to the investors that ended up with very, very low amounts of investment. And then the state have been paying for this very high transition costs for private fund managers. It turned out that all of a sudden they need to pay extra assistance pensions to cover actual pensions, which were not enough. And that was the hay that broke the camel's back. So this is a small map here for you to realize out of 192 countries, only 30 privatize. In baby blue, you have countries have reverted completely or partially to pension system. So what happens next? How are countries supposed to rebuild public systems? And the rest of the presentation, which I will speak very fast because I don't have that much time, what I will show you is an abstraction. After looking all the cases of 18 countries that have reverted privatization, what have they done? And at the end, I will give 11 recommendations that a country might follow wanting to revert pension privatization. And let me tell you that, well, there were a lot of interests involved. There were a lot of threats that this cannot be done and so on and so forth. That's not correct. It can be done. And it can be done as quickly as 3 months. That's what I'm going to explain right now. The first thing that's surprising to see, the first point is the speed in the reforms. So these reforms can go to 3 months, the fastest country, to some more months and even a year. So in general, how countries do this, they start enacting laws that on the one hand will eliminate the individual account system, private system, and will generate a new system. And the basic characteristics of this new public model are that they go back again to defined benefit with contribution of employers, and this contributions will be renegotiated, and this will be managed by the state with a complementary assistential-based system for those people, not in the formal sector. That's what our peer Berenice mentioned, people who need from social assistance. I should tell you that as a result of these models, the reality is that we've seen that poverty has been reduced throughout the countries who have reverted significantly privatization pensions. And that's something that's very, very important. So after this, what you have to do is create a public manager. So this public manager will manage old pensions and to create the new contribution rates and employer contribution rates. This is done through social dialogue that will, of course, be strengthened, and that's something positive for the country because you're reaching all these new agreements that have been weakened in the past. And you collect the contributions and fund administration. Under the new system, you change supervision and oversight of a sector. Some countries will close completely these superintendencies, and the oversight of the pension system passes on to different the public organizations or even the Congress. We have, or the governance of this reform systems is a three-party system. Like I mentioned, social dialogue will be strengthened. And in the few years after this reform of pensions going from private to public, is that we've seen a very strong positive impacts in the reduction of management costs. That is an average around 1%. So from this very high percentages of 50, 30, 20%, these are now 1% or below 1%. And we've seen positive economic impacts, especially reduction of poverty in old age. This is very important. That's fundamental reason why pension systems were created. And then fiscally positive impacts. Because there's no high transition costs. Some people will say, well, you have some other impacts, and that's correct. But this, through sustainability adjustments, might be improved throughout time. And just in closing, I would like to tell you how to revert privatization of pensions, which are the next steps to take. So these are 11 steps. So one of these countries wanted to revert to public pension system. Well, they were going to start through social dialogue to generate consensus and launching communication campaigns. Of course, when they privatized, there were a bunch of marketing campaigns. So it is very important for the public to be well informed and for them to know what's going on. What are the positive aspects behind this? And, well, it's very important to launch this communication campaigns and to start social dialogue and national public debate. so everybody's duly informed. Then, second stage is forming a three-party technical committee, or formation three-party technical committee, with employers, workers, and governments in charge of designing and implementing the renationalization of the pension system. Number three, this technical committee will bring about a series of laws to be enacted, laws that will define the main characteristics of this distribution system based on ILO, international regulations. Number four, creating a public management system. Number five, all those beneficiaries will be transferred to this new public pension manager. Number six, the resources accrued from individual accounts from private sector will be transferred to a public regime. Number seven, we establish new contribution rates. Hold on a second, please. We will establish these new contribution rates, and we will start collecting contributions towards the new public regime of a pension. And we would close out the private system. This private fund manager is very inefficient because they all have the same system. And by having everything centralized, everything will be more effective. Number nine, implementing inspection and oversight services. Number 10, we create the unit or entity in charge of managing the investment of this public pension regime. And number 11, we might consider closing down the oversight agencies for the private sector. Things like the pension superintendency. However, since we have voluntary private savings, well, this could still oversight these accounts. So these are basically the main points behind this book. This book is in English, and there's a translation from summary chapter, and it's downloadable and it's free. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I'm looking forward to moving on with the dialogue. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ortiz. Your presentation really shed light on this. I would like to highlight certain points. For instance, I think it's fundamental. The work done by international organizations, the very ILO, since the creation of the systems, but also influence from the World Bank or the World Monetary Fund in the privatization of systems. And I think that talks about a very large responsibility of those of us working in these organizations, and that is that we need to see. We should only start from economic analysis that many times are deficient in a technical sense, and the underestimation that you mentioned, which is brutal, of a transition cost in Argentina 18 times this underestimation. And I think that in your book you also talk about the case of Nicaragua, where the deficiencies in diagnostics made necessary the reversion of the system before it even started. So I think that stresses out the relevance putting the benefit of people has, and not only economic interests. It also calls my attention the fact that many of the failures, shortcomings that you pointed out to the privatized systems many times become a strength for the privatized system. What do I mean? Failures in democracy and governance. This revolving doors become an element that strengthens and many times block changes to dismantle the systems, or even the concentration of resources. For instance, in Mexico, talking about 15% GDP. In Chile, it's around 70%. So these huge economic interests become political powers that many times block reforms. And in that sense, it calls my attention that out of 14 American countries who privatized their systems, only 5 have reverted these reforms, these privatizations. So when I read this piece of research, the first I read back in 2018, I think it gave me a lot of hope. But I think that this point in time, to 2020, There are concerning signs in countries with a very solid and developed system. There's been attempts of reforming the systems. We still don't know where they're heading towards, but it's like the Brazilian system that has been a very robust system to protect people, or the Uruguayan system, which has been debating what's going to happen with their social security, or the Mexican system, which instead of pushing forward a reform that tends to the most concerning elements of a private system, well, they're betting on the continuity of this private system. So I think that this is very eye-opening. It's a great piece of research, but in reality, everything seems to point to the continuity of these private systems in many countries of America. So I think that that will help the discussion towards the future. So I will leave these ideas on the table. And right now, we'll go to our next panel member. Thank you very much, Dr. Ortiz. Now let's go with Dr. Andres Utop. He's a commercial engineer by the University in Chile and PhD in economy by University of Berkeley in California. He's also worked for the ILO and has been a director of the social development division for LAC and Caribbean. He's been a part of the two presidential advisors committee for two presidential terms in Chile. Now, Dr. Utov is a great analyst and international researcher. I myself remember that when I was starting to get my degree, was one of the first books I used to approach the subject of pensions in Latin America. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce him, for him to join us in this session. Now the floor is yours, Doctor. Thank you very much. Can you see my presentation? Yes? I cannot see you. Okay. So I won't add a lot to what's already been said, but what's interesting here is that I'm going to focus my presentation from the perspective of the pioneer or trailblazing countries in these reforms in social security, which is Chile. I've been closely following the different reforms in Latin America. That's why I'm excusing myself, doing something different, and look at this from the Chilean perspective. And I will try to answer the three questions given to us. What is the evaluation after 39 years of reforms of pension systems in the region? So the first idea should talk about what's been going on since 1981. That is the imposition of a neoliberal ideology. We shouldn't lose sight that Chilean reform sets a unique pillar in this pension system, this distribution system, this substituted by a contribution system and individual capitalization. So this is not collective or partial, so it is individual and total in defined contributions and private management. And as a consequence, this brought about an ideologic change related to economic liberty, which to us in Chile, a production of a dictatorship. Those of us opposed to the system that also made Social Security disappear. So it basically transformed into this mandatory market of provisional savings. And the main objective was not an objective of social security, but rather it was an economic objective trying to homogenize the labor market and trying to promote work mobility, irrespective or independent from each worker. So there was an ideology change that created this mandatory savings market. Now the main characteristics are as follow. The system was segmented in many accounts, and these were homologated into just one structure called provision, cajas de previsión. And based on these principles, they became pension fund managers with or trying to earn a profit in this fundamental reform, because the oversight of the pension system in Chile became an oversight of an industry and not really of the pension system. And actually, at the start of the reform, the superintendency of pensions was not called that. It was called Superintendency of Pension Fund Managers. That is, say, there were oversighting an industry and not a pension system, in such a way that the worker was the only one contributing. And that's why he was able to move from one work to the other. So workers with provisional rights became holders of their accounts, and well, they became consumers of financial services. But well, complete asymmetry in terms of information. So these management companies could have a say on all decisions. So the existing accounts were severely regulated. So they did this through the construction of an extreme pillar. That is to say, they went from one solution, which was a contributional system, distribution, defined benefits and public administration, which was a Bismarck type contributional pillar, to one that transformed the system into a capitalized contributional pillar, individual of defined contribution and private management. That is to say, a private pillar of capitalization, which in every single piece of research, well, it's an extreme case of design of a pension system. And what's important about this is the individual went from being completely responsible of decisions over his pension. That was the logic of transforming the individual to someone who could define what the future of his pension would be. So, in that sense, a completely individualized logic was created. So there's not a collective of people, but rather an individual, like this man here, faced against a system that offers a logic of accruing during his work, increasing his individual savings, and at the end, his savings is capitalized, thus allowing him to purchase a lifelong rent, some sort of scheduled retirement. So this is where the trouble lies. Here's the dilemma of this individual accounts. Because basically, what happens is for there to be a market, each individual contract needs to be actuarially equivalent in such a way that you enter into an agreement with each individual. Tell him you will give me your contributions, social security. We manage that, and we will give you back this duly capitalized. So this has several connotations. It is equivalent to an individual savings account. It accrues contributions, but this is opposed to solidarity. This money is his, profitability is his, and there is no solidarity between contributors. And as a consequence, this is where we disappear all the principles of social security in Chile. The results in Chile is that, we were discussing the comment from our moderator and two panel members before me, this is a dilemma, not in terms how to develop a pension system, but rather a conflict of economic politics, where on the one hand we have people, pension holders completely impoverished. In the case of Chile, I remember that in the last reform, in the last pension commission, it was detected that around 79% of pensions were below minimum wage, 44% under poverty line, and only 29% minimum wage. That was around the year 2015. Unfortunately, these trends have been worsened, and if you see it right, 75% of pension funds were managed by 3 US-based pension fund management systems, each of which had profits that allowed to make their capital whole every 4 years. So this was transformed into a completely profitable business for those partaking in the management of the resources, and well, the pension holders had very bad pensions. And almost all regulations and legislation in conflicts between pension holders and the management system tended to favor the management system and not pension holders. And in Chile, they accrued a fund of around 70-75% of GDP. and that changed with withdrawals and with decrease in interest rates. But this, of course, gives a lot of power to this fund management companies that assign these financial instruments dominated by power groups in Chile. So, my first question is that this is a change in ideology that has led Chile to confrontations in terms of ideology. And right now, it's very hard to have a serious, systematic debate on pension system. And when one does that, there's a series of research centers that have been biased by these private fund management companies. So, what do I consider to be the cause of reforms and counter reforms in pension systems in the region? Why some countries have decided to revert their reforms and some have sustained them? So, I will be based on the document that Isabel just presented, which is the AIP document, which I believe explains clearly what these causes are. I will start with this thought. Chile started its privatization process in 1981. So nothing happened during the 80s. It wasn't until the 90s, 1993, 93 Peru, 94 Argentina, 96 Uruguay, 97 Bolivia, Mexico, and Venezuela, 99 El Salvador, 2000 Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Ecuador in 2001, Dominican Republic 2003, and Panama in 2008. All these countries started including, not necessarily doing a reform as in Chile, with the exception of some countries, regarding the privatization process. And as it was pointed out in the ILO's documents, some countries in Eastern Europe made these reforms, and some other countries in Africa, the ones I'm including here. So, what does this entail? In Latin America, during this decade, we had the debt crisis, and that entailed a contraction of the GDPs, something that's happening with the pandemic right now, which is tremendous. And when there was a need to go out of recession brought about by this debt crisis, most of the countries needed to establish agreements, international agreements for renegotiation of debt with international organizations. So there was this period, is a program of structural adjustment led by the World Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This was mentioned in the other presentations. And this brought about large majority of privatization, but this crisis made evident that capitalization didn't bring about the results that were promised. It didn't generate Orszag's or Stiglitz myths, and as a consequence, many countries in Latin America and the rest of the world started reverting their processes. I won't elaborate on this because this was excellently explained by my peer Isabel Ortiz. Now, examples of this in the region. I think it's important to mention that out of the 14 countries have privatized, they only applied this institutional model in the case of Chile, Salvador, Mexico, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic. Even Chile, Salvador, Mexico, the Dominican Republic maintain it. Bolivia already reverted it, and in El Salvador, they had very interesting measures to establish non-contributional stations. But in Colombia, they followed a parallel model of competition. In the case of Argentina and Uruguay, they came up with mixed models. And in Latin America, we have five countries that have reverted their privatization process, amongst which we can find Argentina, Bolivia, and Venezuela, Ecuador, and Nicaragua, which were kind of cut in half because they never actually implemented it perfectly. And the main problems are these 11, which Isabel mentioned in his presentation: lack of coverage, deteriorating provisional benefits, gender inequality, high transition costs, high management costs, weak regulation, risks by affiliates, and social risk. So I will explain briefly each of these situations in the Chilean case. Case of low coverage, if you remember, we had this 2008 reform in Chile, owing that in 2006, authorities made a diagnosis saying, be careful with the capitalization process that we are undergoing in Chile, because we've spent a huge amount of money in transition costs, but only half population is financing some sort of pension without knowing which. That's why we created the solidarity pillar, which improved coverage, but not necessarily sufficiency. As a consequence, the pure capitalization system without help from the state is completely insufficient to provide universal coverage to the population in Chile. And, well, the thing is that Chile has a more formalized world market as opposed to the other countries in Latin America. So this talks about a defined contribution system, and the parameters have been lagging behind. Profitability has not been as it should have been. And what we detected in the Bravo Commission, well, we see that now 79% is under minimum wage and 44% under the poverty line. That means that most older people under this pension system are below the poverty line or under minimum wage in conditions of vulnerability. And that's including the actions of solidarity pillar. Now, in terms of gender inequality, well, this becomes worse because there's no mechanism in place, solidarity, to avoid gender discrimination in the work markets. In the case of Chile, it allows women to retire earlier and they have longer life expectancy. And since this is calculated based on lifelong rents, well, this will of course will be sufficient. Now the transition costs. In the case of Chile, if you want to make a reform like this, and if some success we had, is that the transition cost was adjusted in the nation's budget. We had an implicit debt of 136% of GDP. That means that deficit reached 6%, and today it's still of 2% of GDP because we're still paying for that. And trying to adjust 6 points of GDP in a budget that can only be done in under de facto governments with important cutbacks to other expenses. The administration cost is still a tremendous problem in Chile because, well, this is an oligopoly that's been tried to be solved with some market instruments like bidding, but that doesn't work. Actually, the competing companies trying to offer lowest fees for new affiliates, well, they win the biddings, and when they win it, they raise these fees again. So this is an oligopolical market. That doesn't operate as a market should operate. Now, concentration, safe markets, or insurance market. Again, we're talking about this lifelong rents as a consequence of insurance industry and pension management companies are right now fundamental in Chile for management of Chilean economy and in managing the economic interests of the most powerful groups. Illegitimacy, in the sense that workers or the owners of the capitals are not duly represented in the AFPs or investment in the industry where they're supposed to be investing. That's why there's a high degree of illegitimacy. And workers don't feel that they're in a system that represents them. Then the corralito, in the sense that prudential regulation out of risk and profitability, means that the affiliate undertakes all the risks and not the state or the system. And as a consequence, they only see that risk, or what happened in the world market, they will have low contributions and they will experience this at the end of their active life, and as a consequence, they feel like they have just accrued savings, and at the end of the working life, they realize that this was a bad decision. In case of scarce real investment, there hasn't been financial development in Chile. examples of Finland, where you can actually invest in what the country needs. That's why we have the instruments and the conditions, oversight and financial regulations from AFPs for them to actually invest in what the country needs and at the same time to have enough liquidity to pay pensions. So, the fact that they need to compete in profitability has made AFPs to invest in very liquidable financial instruments. And, well, they have a better yield abroad, supposed to the country. Now, systemic risks, all of them are transferred to the individual, which is increasing life expectancy, investment profitability, and vulnerabilities. And this is called contribution density. And finally, a social dialogue, which we didn't have during the dictatorship, and so far we have been incapable of achieving a true social dialogue regarding the pension systems. So the commissions, with my reference to when this was presented, I have been part of this. These are only technical commissions that only talk or hold some audiences with the citizens, but they're not necessarily represented by AFP in the solutions we're looking for. But this is more a technocratic aspect, the way this has been happening so far. Now, what are the challenges of the pension system in the region in terms of coverage, replacement rates, and financial sustainability? Talking about Chile, what we have in Chile right now, at least this figure here, where the green triangle, the green arrow, talks about the coverage of the capitalization system, individual capitalization system, and the triangle in red is the role that the solidarity pillar plays. So people with this savings account moving in the base, the green triangle, starts accruing capital that allows to have a better pension. So that's the logic behind it. Till the year 2008, people have accrued something, but we don't know which amount. After 2008, the 2008 reform created the solidarity pillar that reached those people that haven't contributed anything, and it will start being dissolved the more the people contribute. So the subsidy by the state and the system to be able to increase coverage. This is focused. This is not an acquired right. It's not for all citizens. It's only for those who can show that once they reach an old age, that they've only have a bad, poor pension, but that they belong to this family of 60% poorest people in the country. What we know until the year 2008 is that if you trace this poverty line for all elderly people coverage, 44% are under the poverty line and 79% under minimum wage. And well, this is decreasing according to current trends. So this explains a little bit the results that we've gotten as the current situation, because the system has not provided good attention, thus generating a lot of impoverishment of the population at old age. So the purpose is improving pensions. So you have a bunch of numbers that you're free to go over in your free times. But just to illustrate a case of women, for instance, imposable income is around $722,000 for 570,000 pesos. In the historic average self-financed pension, talking about $138. No, I'm sorry, $175, a very low replacement rate, and this goes up a little bit using solidarity pillar to $181. That is more than half. Women have very low replacement rates. If you have contributed for a bunch of years, let's say between 35 and 40 years, you get 391,000 pesos, $495, and medium self-finance to solidarity contribution is of $510, 403,000 pesos. And as a consequence, the replacement rates, even for people who have been contributing between 35 and 40 years, those considered as high density of contributions, is still very low. What I want to show here, doing the same work, is as of May 2019, instead of the situation improving, is worsening. So, self-finance situation of women with solidarity. The pillar is of $366. But the situation is that instead of improving, the situation has been worsening for the pandemic and social crisis that we had in October. So year 2020, this numbers could be even worse. So what does this mean? What results do we have? What the model predicted, and allow me to explain these two charts for men and women. What I hear here in the base is that people contributing between 0 and 1 year, 5 and 10, and so on and so forth, until reaching 35 and 40. Same goes for case of men. So historically, we have this inverted U, which is the way in which the affiliates that achieved retirement were distributed throughout the history of the system. So that's the distribution for women and the distribution for men. So what is predicted is that the system would generate so much savings, so much financial savings, that it would be translated into real investment growth and formalization of a workforce. And what was expected is to have this red curve. A lot of people gathered in the high contribution level because, well, of the formalization of the workforce. What we saw in reality, and well, this for the last years, this chart. And for women, contrary to what was predicted, large majority is being concentrated in low levels of contribution density. And for men, we'll have a bimodal distribution, some high, but a lot low. And as a consequence, the work market becomes an essential variable in terms of what a contribution system might do, especially this one of individual capitalization. Now, what's the meaning of this? So if you say, let's work on a system that actually operates like distribution system, that after a certain level, you'll get pension and the others won't, that means that if you set, or if you contribute between 10 and 15 years, some will get a pension, those to the right. And for women, 60% would be without warranty under this pension system. And the distribution for men is kind of constant, around 44%, those people without any warranties. So this would be measured in the left axis. And as a consequence, we have this problem in Chile, because AFPs would like to get with the cream of the crop of contributors, those best contributors, and ignoring those that don't contribute enough. So we would end up with this dual or segmented system, which is not what's proposed by Social Security. And the big challenge here is how to integrate these people into a system that will generate enough incentives to contribute more. And if they cannot do that, they would still have relatively good pensions. And that's where we need to combine contribution and non-contribution resources adequately. So this is just illustrating what I just mentioned in the previous slides. You can see here we have the median without subsidy, median with subsidy, the median without subsidy, and the median with subsidies. And you have these values here, Unidad de Fomento in Chile, which is measured versus real value each year. So in the case of women, 89.9% would be median low, a rate of 24% without state help, and 31% state help. In the case of men, that improves a little bit, 54.1%, medium low, minimum wage, a replacement rate of 48% without help, and 60% with state help. So what does this mean? That in general, in all countries, and this is a generalization, of course, that they were expert in pension funds, visiting the country, that in Chile, the debate regarding the industry kind of forgot that the parameters could not be adequate enough. And what's been clearly shown nowadays is that the low density of contribution is a new parameter that we have and is extremely relevant when, well, or at least in this defined contribution system. And, well, the level of contribution rates we were operating was also important, still important right now. And, well, right now it's a bit difficult to change in terms of legal age of retirement with poor working conditions. So, one of the main challenges that we have in Chile and the countries in general is how to go over the current parameters in such a way that we can finance minimum pensions. And, well, we cannot do this, we will need structural changes under this condition because, well, we know that the work market offers low contribution densities and the situation in general is difficult. And like I mentioned in previous work, interest rates are converging into real interest rates because the funds around 8-10% in Chile, or maybe below 4%, closer to 3% in case of Chile. Now the work market is designed for formal workers, dependent. Now independent work compete with provisional savings, and as a consequence, this eludes the system, and there's a lot of hidden work. So you need to establish new work negotiations, regulation for a segmented market, including provisional savings for each of the cases.
Also, the issue of legitimacy has been signaled here. They say that in certain parts of the world, the owners of these pension funds do not leave anyone here. They don't let them do anything where they invest their money. So it's necessary that workers, as owners of the funds, decide which assets are invested in their funds and that they are a part of this. And finally, there is a solidarity pillar in Chile. We need to generate a contributive solidarity pillar because most workers are not in the solidarity pillar to alleviate poverty and they are not in the contributive pillar. So as a consequence, there is a middle class where they don't get any help from the solidarity pillar and they don't have the conditions to really have good pensions. I would finally like to say that that which we think needs to be done in Chile, starting from what we have and what could be done, following this structure by Isabel Ortiz. So, this is what was going on before the 2008 reform. The capitalization system, which is the green part, the green triangle. Then there was the general part for people who already had 20 years worth of contribution, which was very little. So people were saying that it was not enough to cover their needs. Then with the 2008 reform, the solidarity pillar was created. So they are actually contributing to it and they are changing the minimum pension. So here what happens is that there are two things we have already saying it's not really enough. We have the poverty line, we have the minimum wage, and as a consequence in Chile, we are first of all trying to generate the universal basic pensions guaranteed with a charge to general taxes so that everybody has a level of dignity guaranteed by the state. Second of all, to build this contributive solidarity pillar, which can be transferred by means of additional contributions. And what is discussed here is that employers should contribute with 6% to build this. And number three, just as a complement, to have a voluntary or mandatory savings. Now, our big challenge is to get to at least pensions for most people equivalent to the minimum wage as a dignity level. And as a replacement rate, I am sure it's going to be more than that. This is the effort that we have to make to build the Social Security stairs. Thank you very much. That's it for my presentation. Thank you very much, Doctor. We got a lot of clarity from your participation. It really helps clarify things and it helped us get really important ideas throughout your presentation. The first thing that I would like to highlight, for example, is that there is a very important conclusion. Privatizing the Chilean pension system ended with social security principles and it made risks and responsibility individual, which goes against all solidarity elements or collective protection elements because that has to be the core of social security itself. I was surprised. Last time I read something about the amount of resources gained by pension fund management. And this is actually, I mean, it was a huge amount. And as you were saying, it makes any discussion about pension systems to become a political economy element. There is a lot to say about what you just mentioned. Now, I would simply like to stick to the last remarks about the proposals that the system should follow in the immediate future to create a universal pension, which is guaranteed, the solidary contributive pillar, and there is one thing that I think is really important in this second proposal the fact that employers are contributing again. I think that is one of the elements that really marked this ideological twist that you mentioned. Employers stopped being co-responsible for the protection of people even though they are making profit from them. Historically speaking, this could be interpreted, I mean, the origin of Social Security as a payment or contribution made by employers to precisely contribute to the protection of the people from whom they were getting profit, which allowed them to constitute big capitals. I also think that that last proposal about voluntary savings, which is only a complement or should be only a complement, I think that would be a radical change because from being the core of the Chilean pension system, it would move on to being simply a complementary part, which takes me back to multi-pillar segments, right? Even promoted by the ILO itself. I think it's very relevant. I think it's quite right. And of course, it gives us a lot of clarity when you gave us that description of the Chilean model and the deficiencies that still persist and how that is expressed in several countries because in one way or another they have followed this same model. Now, I don't want to keep on talking. So now we will move on to the next part in the schedule. Now, each one of the speakers will have around 7 minutes to talk if they wish to use this time in the same order of the presentation. So we'll start with Dr. Ramirez Lopez and Dr. Ortiz, and finally we would go back to you, Doctor, in case there are questions or comments from our audience. So, Doctor? Thank you very much. I think the presentations by Isabel and Alejandra were really excellent. They allowed us to pinpoint the evidence that we have, globally speaking, on this individualized, privatized system which has left many workers outside. That is why I had a basic question to look at, and specifically in the case of Mexico, because we are living a situation where a bill is to be submitted. And that really caught our attention because we have a government which is concerned with the well being of the people. The government has made some interesting progress. For example, the well-being pension for people over the age of 68 and over 65 if they are from an indigenous group or if they are people with disabilities or Afro-Mexican people. So I think that's really significant even though the amount is low because actually it's more than the rural basic staples cost, but not in the case of the urban one. So Considering this and going back to the proposals and the issues, which are actually a political economy issue, well, that takes us precisely to these economic power disputes. They don't want that to change. They don't want the pension funds to change. Now, I think that also people don't know how the Mexican system works because some people go like, okay, this is one version of what has happened in the Mexican reality, but in our Treasury Department, well, they are the ones who were in charge of the reform back in 1995. And then we go back to this perspective where there are two models. There is no way we can keep the distribution system, but no one is saying that we should go back to the distribution system as it was before, and that the only possible option is the capitalization of private management. So I think that that's why it's important that the lower house of Congress will take this and really discuss this issue in depth, that they take the important elements of this bill. What are the interesting aspects of this bill? They have to acknowledge that 1,250 weeks worth of contributions because of the reality of the work environment, that is to say, 24.5 years of contributions. Well, in actually, in the Mexican reality, that's not happening. So 750 weeks should be important enough to grant a pension. But it looks like the discussion is only about fighting for a basic pension, only for a guaranteed pension, when actually we have to recover the possibilities that social security systems have so that we can provide a well-being basis and to really stress the distribution part. It looks like there are several elements which are not considered in the current Mexican market reality, and that is that the tax code will increase because what workers are saving is not going to be enough to give them that guaranteed pension, and since that is a state obligation, they will have to contribute. So public resources are still transferred to the private sector. The public sector is still supporting the failures of the private sector, and nobody is holding the private sector accountable. Like, why have you not been profitable enough? Why is there like this monopoly here? And it's like what you were saying about the Chilean case, right? They are holding many of the resources, and here it's the same. It's the same thing. Only a few are holding all of this. Now, why the limit to contributions? Well, the private sector is a system that lives from what they are getting in terms of commissions from workers. It's not so much their profitability. In the Mexican case, 64 million accounts provide a lot of commissions, as opposed to 23 or 21 million workers under IMSS, right? Who make daily contributions. So these ILO elements, which we got familiar with in 2018, and which allowed us to carry on with the 11 points. I did that for the Mexican case in an economic publication. I took the points mentioned by Isabel and then I showed them based on the Mexican reality. However, I think that it was interesting that Isabel showed that in this forum because it is saying that there are possibilities, issues, discussions. Andres was also mentioning an important element about the social dialogue. Sometimes people go like, okay, we need to call for dialogue in order to do this reform, but they are still focusing on a technical dialogue and they are actually not including unions, workers, the population itself. I mean, they don't defend Social Security because they have never had it. So these informal workers, for example, or freelancers, I mean, For example, they are like, I'd love to have a pension, but I've never had it. So how can I defend a system that I have never had access to? So I believe that this is a good opportunity, that this initiative, in the case of Mexico, where it was submitted, I hope that this bill will be discussed widely. It's not like they need to approve it just like that without any discussion. They have to discuss it and take the substantial aspects of it to really move on to a feasible proposal for the reality in the Mexican market, in the salary sector here. And I think that, as I said before, it is essential to really recognize all sorts of work. The world reality is telling us that people are working more and more as freelancers. There is more and more work mobility. Now there is a technological part. Now there is a pandemic, and that is opening jobs in the service sector, but more and more unprotected. So that's another discussion. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleagues because I would really like to listen to what they have to say. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed my colleagues' presentations. Basically, we are saying the same thing, so I don't want to repeat that. Just to wrap up, I would like to say that we should go back to basics. And basics means why were uh, pension funds created? That was one of the first social security schemes all over the world. Historically speaking, countries started with pensions and then they got rid of that just to avoid poverty and vulnerability in senior citizens after they retire. So that's the essential motive. It was not to satisfy the private insurance sector or to contain tax costs. I mean, they did that through a social agreement with the unions, the governments, the employers, in order to eradicate the terrible vulnerability of people when they retired. So that's the motive, the reason for the systems of pensions and all other types of social security. We're talking about motherhood or disabilities, and we need to maintain that. We need to stick to the actual motives why we want this system. And ultimately, we are looking at 192 countries in the world. Most of them have public systems. Only a small minority started experiencing privatization. So this, I don't know, 30 countries, 18 out of them, they are actually reverting privatization. So that tells us a lot about what the best system is. Of course, there are nuances, as Berenice was saying, of course, but we need to resist to the pressure that is being put on many governments by former institutions, really, by old institutions, so to speak, saying that the private system will be less expensive with time or more ideal, and so on and so forth. That is not true. Historical evidence proves that that is not true. On the contrary, what is true is that most countries have public systems because these are the most effective and efficient systems for the goals related to poverty and vulnerability in senior citizens. Thank you. Thank you. Doctor, congratulations, Berenice and Isabel, for your presentations. I think that we are on the same page. Anyone who seriously analyzes pension systems will reach similar conclusions. As Isabel was suggesting, going back to basics, it's important to understand contributions to social securities. The contribution rates, well, they say that that is the workers' savings, but that disappeared. What a social security contribution rate disappeared, right? So both employers and employees need to do that to cover the risks. For example, for old age, death, handicap, disability. So that is an important element that we need to rescue. going back to the source of what social security is, to go back to what these principles mean, and then move forward based on that. What I can tell you is that when we talk about distribution here, uh, we immediately hear that, right? Like they're broke. I know that some systems are broke, and maybe we need to understand how the distribution needs to be done. For example, through a social collective contribution. So, my first comment here would be going back to basics, as Isabel was saying, and recover the concepts and the principles of social security. The second point would be that today we have not so much a pensions debate, but rather an economic, a political economy debate. And in some countries, there are public pension funds which are really working, but they are doing other types of investments. Competitive companies that need to compete for liquidity and profitability, and therefore they don't make the investments that the country needs. And at the same time, there are many benefits and profits for economic groups, so that's also economic power. And that is also related to technocrats, of course. But in a way, I think that we need to dismantle that, so to speak, or maybe go to colleagues who are really telling the truth when they defend one of the components. My third point is that I believe that there are positive conditions in Latin America which will not prevent us from doing a good pension systems or to do what's necessary to get to that good pension systems. I mean, that's up to any country to do. This discussion about the parameters, like which are the parameters, well, in Chile, when the system was created, I mean, everything was solved with the parameters. This is not a demographic issue, so every individual will just decide to save more, and as a consequence, there will be no issue about not having enough savings when they retire. So I think that we need to go back to these parameters, and that's important. But there is a new one also, which is related to the labor market, which is the need for contributions. I think that is a variable that we should be measuring. I think that the charts that I showed are really interested in the sense that we are seeing, right? Like the model and how it's moving. Maybe it's moving in the opposite direction, and that implies something about the current reality, which is probably derived from the pandemic and mobilization and things that are we are seeing more and more. And as a worker, a person, still needs to have adequate contributions. However, they will need to look for other mechanisms to finance their pensions. Now, the second point is that regardless of the system, there will be no simple distribution, but more like a distribution with reserve funds. And I think that we need to be careful with that when it comes to pension funds. And what is the likelihood that those pension funds will be collective or individual, and that they can actually be safeguarded to have a relatively reasonable interest rate or growth rate so that they can be productive enough for employment in each country. The third point would be the contribution rate. I think that it kind of has lagged behind. In the case of Chile, our percentage, 10% is really low. Some people are talking about 16%. Some people are talking about getting to 20%. Some other people say 9% and 9%. But I think it's still behind. And that has economic connotations, of course. We cannot ignore that because that affects the cost of labor contributions, informality versus formality, and that's something that we should debate carefully. And then the third point is what happens with demographics. Demographics tells us that in most of our countries we have a high life expectancy. It's like a tsunami of growth. But there is a variable in the distribution system. right? And for capitalization as well. And that is a relatively difficult political variable because some people do not have good contributions when they reach retirement age. So we should look at that in each of our countries and see what options those people have to work at that age. If you are looking at workers there, well, that means something. That means something is happening. And also dignity. People need to understand what their pension systems are, to love them and to defend them. And I think that is our task. So those are my comments, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much for your participation. This was excellent. Thank you. Thank you, all three members of the panels. I think your contributions were really good in this last intervention. I think that Dr. Ramirez Lopez's remark was really interesting. Her remark about reform being not only a product of technocrat debates away from social dialogue, right? I think that we have witnessed how this has prevailed. And as Dr. Ortiz was saying, there can be reforms. Privatizations can be reverted in less than 3 months, but privatization can also happen in less than 3 months. In Mexico, we saw that, right? They took advantage of the national holidays to impose that system. So that's really important. And as an international organization, we have to foster social dialogue, a three-way dialogue, always ensuring workers' representation because they are entitled to that. It's their benefits, but also employers. And I think that Dr. Andres was also mentioning something really important. The owners of the funds and the individual capitalization funds, they need to be a part of the managers' directories, right? Because usually investment decisions are made by the owners of these big financial consortiums, and I think that we need to polish that. Also, Dr. Ortiz's idea was really interesting about going back to basics, going back to the core of pension systems, because they are systems to avoid poverty and vulnerability. That should be our guiding principle for any type of reform, and not only about sustainability or values like efficiency or profitability of these funds. And Dr. Andrasuto was also saying something that's really valuable about the importance of parameters. I think that sometimes the actual conditions, even when it comes to political economy, they make it difficult, right, for us to advance in increasing people's well being or coverage or access to benefits. And that can be modifying the parameters themselves. Maybe that, I mean, not having so much political confrontation, like reverting a pension system. I don't know. I mean, these are the elements that I wanted to highlight. And now we will move on to questions and comments from our audience. There is one element which caught my attention, which was brought up in the three presentations, and that's the fact that oftentimes these privatizations have not actually worked to improve national development. In the 90s, with these reforms, it was said that it was precisely to establish financial markets in the countries so that we did not have to depend on foreign private support so as to boost national development. But that has not been the case. Accordingly, one of the questions, actually two questions, which I will try to summarize into one, would be like, the accumulated resources in pension systems, especially for individual capitalization, how can they be used to really boost national development? Some people are wondering, like, how to prevent them from going abroad, or to be invested in public debt only, because oftentimes, depending on the situation, that could be useful for infrastructure investment, for example, for projects that will contribute to national development. However, they can be used only for current expenses, which really has not many benefits, strictly speaking. So that's one question. How can we use that for national development? All right, so let's go to this first question and then we can move on. Who'd like to begin? I can start if you'd like me to. Of course. We need to make the difference between development financing, which is what the question is about, like how can we transfer savings to the country's needs by means of investment savings. That's the actual savings and financing for development. Now, what we need is to acknowledge that a private or public pension system is creating financial savings, not actual savings. That is to say, workers have these resources and they need that profitability. Consequently, the link that we're missing would be financial development, not financing for development, but financial development. That is to say, creating those instruments where we can create the funds, right? Because remember that pension funds do not invest directly in that kind of things. They invest in financial instruments, which they are then placed in financial markets. I mean, that would be fantastic if that existed. We can talk about mortgages, for example. That was really successful in Chile for the real estate market. The banking system was generating debt instruments for people who wanted to buy a house, and that debt instrument was deducted in the financial market, and then that was purchased by pension funds. The risk is assumed by the bank, but the profitability goes to the pension fund. So that is a type of need that we have. We design those investment funds, but that's actually the work of the financial work to generate those instruments, but that's a need that has not existed. I think this is an important question that is a task that we have not accomplished in Latin America when it comes to developing the pension system. If I can continue, please. Yes, I agree. This question is really important, and we could solve it at first by regulating investments, requiring that investments be only at a national level, or maybe setting a very high limit, excuse me, a very low limit to what can be done internationally in terms of investments in this regard. So, what happens is that the national capital markets are not developed enough. That is what Andras was saying. Probably the essential motive why pensions were privatized was to take individual savings from people with their pensions and to put that in capital markets. There was a real will to develop national capital markets, but that did not work for different reasons. To begin with, some capital markets were so little developed, or in some cases, not developed at all. Like in Kazakhstan, for example, they did not have the capital markets. So pensions were privatized, and at the same time, they had to create a stock exchange market because that did not exist there. So since they were not so developed, the national capital markets were not so attractive. They did not have enough return, so that is why they stayed out of them. And then, as you mentioned, in some governments, public debt was also an issue because those transition costs were actually so large that they needed to work on that because actually public funds were going to very high GDP percentages for the pension funds management. So they wanted them to invest in safe public debt. But that was like an absurd vicious circle where the money is leaving the state, then it's going to the pension funds management, and then they are investing that in public debt, right? Of course, cashing all of the commissions again. And so that's like the circle of money, and that is the reason why countries actually have reverted privatization.
Because in general, it's not sustainable, it's absurd, this vicious cycle. So if the question is, what can we do? Yes, of course we can regulate, but we need to take all these problems into consideration, things that we will face. And, well, maybe trying to have a broader look, trying to look at the big picture to be able to see what is it that we have to reform. Well, in that sense, talking about myths, there was a lot of talk about this privatization of pension funds, which show evidence in terms of internal growth, but it's clear to see that what was created was forceful saving, mandatory saving, but that really has to do with the world market. So it's what Andres says, that there's no development of finances. What people do is just purchasing stock and bonds. It doesn't go to productive investment. Now, what countries under different pension system channel towards productive investment? Well, those countries have done individual capitalization, but in national accounts. Countries which resources can be channeled towards what Isabel mentioned, for instance, towards certain sectors. In the case of Canada, that this money goes into nuclear power investments. So you have these different modalities, but for the case of our countries, they are very linked to pointing out, well, since we don't have enough capital markets, well, let's ship them abroad. And, well, for the case of Mexico, well, they go to stock markets with only 100 companies, largest companies, and that's how you get the vicious cycles in terms of transference of public resources to private resources, and that's cheap financing for large companies. That doesn't really require it, or companies in other sectors, and not in sectors that would foster productive investment. Thank you very much for replying these questions. And yes, it's true. Many times this privatized systems and hasn't yielded the best investments. We have another question from the audience about the counterpart. Because many times, well, this is a myth, and other times this is a reality regarding the efficiency or lack thereof of the state to best management the resources from pension systems. So the questions are, in those cases where privatization is reversed, how to warranty that the inefficiency, how to warranty that there's not inefficiency for these resources to be poorly invested or just wasted, or for there not to be corruption in this system that's trying to go public again. You mind if I answer? Well, you need to create this Chinese wall between pension funds and the nation's funds because it cannot be managed complementary. That is to say, if investment funds need to invest in the government bonds, that should be done through a very well established supervision method in the industry and financial sector. And this should be totally justified, otherwise, it will happen what happened in the Contigua. that large part of the resources were used to finance the nation's budget with the justification of helping the society, but it didn't have the profitability to make this pension fund grow. So we need to generate this Chinese wall between government budget and investment fund, and number two, a good regulation and oversight. Pretty much what we talked about in the previous question, about what type of instrument, which might be state-based, the fund could be invested in. Just to elaborate, I have exactly the same feeling. In a public system, what you should do is having some sort of a unit devoted to investment. That unit is important to be independent without external pressures from the government. There should be, and also a regulation organization, the functions of the superintendency. But it shouldn't be this superintendency because of problems of the revolving doors and contributions. It should be other type of real independent public organization, and that's the way it's made work in many countries. I mean, in any life choices, there's risks, but we tend to demonize the state sector. But that's not true. Many state organizations are very efficient in terms of management, especially in developed countries, high-income countries. I guess just to conclude, I would just point out that we should enter this discussion regarding, yes, we have had corrupt governments and states, but also private initiative has been a part of these mechanisms. So we should step away of this discussion whether private sector is more efficient than public sector, where there's clear evidence, as even in Latin America, with the Obrick case, in which has been the behavior of the private sector in this sense. So if there's a strengthening based on state, good oversight and good regulation, not among themselves, but having an adequate regulation with autonomy, I think it is possible to establish this correct supervision or oversight. Thank you very much. I have one question, a little bit complicated to answer. The question is, which would be the best way to warranty, I mean, pensions for people, taking into consideration all the options that we've revised, which would be the best model, you would say? And another question that complements the first, which would be the reasons why privatization was implemented only in developed countries? No, why it was only implemented in developing countries? Those would be the two questions. Would you like to start, Andreas? No, Isabel, take this one. I mean, I thought you would start because that's the way we've been doing things. But okay, so historically, like we said, really privatization was some sort of an experiment. That's why this was done in developing countries because, well, they were treated as guinea pigs because no high-income countries would ever dare do something like this because unions will be all over them and population will be all over them. And even social awareness is different and social pressures are different. So this was attempted in countries with an appropriate regime for that purpose. And, well, the case of Chile, this was done during General Pinochet's dictatorship. And this was attempted in very few countries. Out of 192 countries in the world, only 30 embarked in this privatization experiment, and most of them have reverted. So, very few countries available for this experiment. And, well, due to this subjective governance. And going back to the best way of warranting retirement, actually in the ILO, what we did was to relaunch this multi-pillar pension system. So that's pretty much what my peers before me talked about, Andreas and Berenice. You would get a universal basic pension. Obviously, you would have this basic pillar for everybody, and based on that, you might start building a mandatory social security, this being public pensions we were talking about, and based on that, you could build other regimes. That might be some complementary, small regimes, and well, voluntary personal savings. But the largest, huge pillar behind the national pension system should be mandatory social security. And just to wrap up this Q&A, many people had this question regarding the effects of this current COVID-19 pandemic on the pension systems, and other questions pertaining to the large social and economic transformations that we're facing, things like automation and what's been called the future of labor. And something that even to newer generations thought is something like very far away, like working from home. So, what would be the effects of this process a little bit more immediate, like the pandemic, and the other effects, which are trends that will affect both mercantile structures, labor structures, and even demographic structures. Well, in conclusion, because I think that it's time for the next roundtable to begin. I think that to build a pension model, we should go back to basics in terms of why are we creating it? Well, to cover the risk of the life cycle, in this case, old age. Because going towards old age, people are left without income. And well, we should take into consideration the reality of the countries, take into consideration also these principles of universality and solidarity that gave birth to it and that provide context to it. And the pandemic has made patent the frailty of social security in the countries in general. Because, well, we have to take into consideration that it's including health systems. And, well, it rendered this perspective of neglect and impact that privatization has had, that the impact of low public investment in health system for the case of Latin American countries. And not only the state of institutions as such, but also state of health of population in Latin America. The fact that we had a lot of deaths in Mexico, that's related to the state of health of our population in general, things like obesity and all other elements such as diabetes and heart conditions that have been neglected because of the destruction of the public system. So this is a very important wake-up call to reinforce public institutions. And this is a very important wake-up call to strengthening public social security. That's why I mentioned early in my presentation that it should be core in building this new pension model where we place human security and well taking care of life as core. And also take into consideration that a pension system needs to be constantly revised based on how demography is changed, how the new ways of working are changing, because what we see is increase in precarity in the last couple of months because of the type of work that has been strengthened. What has to do with service distribution. These are really workers without salary. They live on tips and they're not incorporated into social security. So that type of work has been strengthened in most of our countries, but we also see there's been an important growth of large industries linked with telecommunications. because these are giving us the opportunity of holding this very large forum. So there's very big chance of profitability there. So we need to think how this major earnings that they've made in this months, how it should be distributed amongst the society. And yeah, very quickly, I'm going back to the previous question about the development of capital market. What's appealing about savings, I mean worker savings, is that if you do it correctly, this is something that's long term. I mean, most savings are short term. People save for something very quick, not long term. And this type of savings, well, it's savings done through a long time, and that allows for a capital market. However, this has huge transition costs. And, well, this was able to be done in Chile because of the dictatorship, and we pretty much adjusted to the budget. You cannot do that in a democracy. And, well, that's what made most countries fail, because they tried to do this substitution very radically a la Chile. And why developing countries? Well, in my presentation, I talk about the indebtedness crisis that affected a lot of countries in Latin America, and that had to do with the conditionality of international institutions that forced us in doing some effort to privatize our pension systems. And regarding the pandemics and its trends, what we will see towards the future is that it's going to be even harder having contribution systems. So we need to think how to make this contribution system work. So we'll probably need a different tax structure for us to be able to collect, and we'll then be able to find the survival and old age of people without, without them being necessarily contributors. So that's one of the challenges lying ahead. And in general, for the case of Chile, the pandemic, aside from all health items, Berenice talk about, as you all know, because it was very publicized, we had the withdrawal of funds of 10% of most of our contributors. So they were trying to do what the government was not doing, having an emergency fund during the pandemic when they were forced going to quarantine their homes, not being able to work. People did not have an income. So, as a consequence, they turned to this 10% of their pension funds solution. So this means that we don't have a real good social protection system, because a pension system is meant to work in this type of emergencies. So we don't have a social security system for this type of emergency. That's why we needed to resort to 10% of the workers' savings. So in the case of Chile, savings were decreased, and we're facing the possibility of having to come up with a new subsidy. So I was working for an ILO, and we analyzed work people work because of money incentives. But right now we have a lot of limitations, people to have a well-paid work in the traditional sense. So we need to have in place non-contribution system financed by taxes in general to be able to satisfy the needs of people in terms of social well-being, which is what we talked about early in the session. Thank you. I don't know if somebody would like to add anything else, or I think we should close this table. So, I would like to thank you for your participation. This went longer than we scheduled. This panel, but it's a great subject, and we have expert panel members. So we made the most out of your time. So thank you very much to all participants. And for our attendees, we expect you our next round table at 11:30. So thank you very much for coming.